Good afternoon. My name is Michelle, and I work as a regional director for Illumio for the ASEAN and South Asian region. I'm here to talk to you about a new trend in the cybersecurity industry, and we're going to talk about containment. So this is getting a lot of traction in different markets, and I would like to give you an introduction and walk you through some key concepts around this. Looking forward to your participation at the end through the question and answer session. So just to give you a high level agenda, I would like to talk about or start this conversation is really to start looking at two areas. One is ransomware and malware, how this industry or how these attacks have trended over the last few decades, and to look at where they are right now. I'm also here to talk to you about some of the existing solutions that organizations are using in a bid to reduce the impact and mitigate the effect of threats like ransomware and malware. I'd also like to start talking about the gap that resides between the threat and the types of solutions or the approaches, both from a technology perspective and from an operational perspective to manage these threats. I'm going to introduce the idea of zero trust and how it fits very well into a ransomware strategy. And I'll talk to you about how different organizations are taking initial steps in their zero trust journey to make sure that their investments are protected, one, and they get the most impact out of initial starter investment into zero trust. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is ransomware. So if we think about ransomware, this word has come up a lot in the last decade. We've seen things like NotPetya, we've seen things like Maze, and GandCrab that have come up in conversations. They're quite synonymous today with the cybersecurity industry. But are they a new phenomenon? Is this a new concept? So let me take you back to 1989. There was an AIDS conference and different people were attending from WHO, and there was a Harvard-educated researcher there called Dr. Pops, who basically came up with the first strain. Right? So he sent 20,000 different floppies across to multiple people. Right? And this was the first time we started seeing it. It wasn't called ransomware at the moment. It was called a Trojan. And his demand was, once your files got encrypted, you would have to pay about $380 to get back your data. Now, he was arrested, but he wasn't tried because he was claimed to be unfit for trial. But the point here is, this has been here for a really long time. We haven't called it ransomware throughout its tenure, but it has been around for a very long time. And the question really is, we've had 30 years to come up with a strategy that would effectively protect organizations from ransomware. And we have struggled every bit of the way. And if you want to look at 30 years later, looking at 2017 to this year, I might argue that there is an exponential growth in the cost and the attack trends for ransomware. There are a couple of reasons behind this. One is the amount of knowledge behind ransomware in terms of attackers and learning and picking up their different attack threats is increasing. Two, monetization is huge. This is seen as an industry where you can make a fair amount of money and easily with those attacks that you spread. Now, ransomware, ransom payment is not always guaranteed. As we have seen, organizations have technologies, and I'm going to talk about that. And three is the availability of ransomware infrastructure as a service. So this is now becoming a quick way for new attackers or hackers to think of ways to actually deploy and scale their business and monetize it as fast as they can without investing in huge pieces of infrastructure. So there is a business angle behind ransomware, and that's causing some of the challenges. Now, why are the costs increasing though? Because if we had strong technology or processes in place, then this booming business would obviously be curtailed at some point. But it is increasing because we've failed at that. And I think this is the question that we have to all ask: how do we get to a point where we get better at this, right? And it may not always be all about detection and stopping the threat on its own. So if you look at 2017, NotPetya kicked out, and we started seeing a large amount of impact globally. It wasn't a US problem. It wasn't an Asian problem. It was a global problem. We saw 45 seconds. That's all it took for Ukrainian bank's network to be brought down. 90 seconds for large shipping liners endpoints to go down. right? There was outage for about 2 weeks in that specific scenario. And then you start seeing the amount or point of presence that this ransomware had across the world. It was all over the news. And then we start seeing in 2018, see SamSam kicking in. See 2019, we see a large number of notorious ransomware kicking out. And then we see in 2020, we see it with Maze. And that is also at the moment proliferating throughout different regions. So the reality is that ransomware is growing and it is very, very successful. Now, I want to talk to you about one element about ransomware that is particularly aggressive, and that is its speed. Its speed to compromise a laptop, its speed to move across the network, its speed to cause impact, and its speed of execution, right? And as I talked about, ransomware through infrastructure or ransomware as a service is not making it any slower, right? This is moving faster. So its speed is actually causing one of the problems. Now, if you look at the different technologies that we've used to protect ourselves against ransomware and malware, they all follow an underlying theme. Let me walk through some of these tools. Antivirus was a simple way of looking at identifying threats based on what they look like. That evolved to EPP and is now evolved to EDR. Now, EDR looks at sophisticated ways of detecting and responding to a threat. They look at machine learning, they look at threat triage, they look at very quickly updated sources of IPs and bad IPs. And then you've got tools like NAC, which basically work with these other tools to identify a compromised device, and based on that, would either push it off the network or quarantine the device, right? NAC is more tied to a network than the AV solutions are. But the underlying theme here is that all these investments are really looking at two things. One is detection. If I can detect the threat, then I would respond to it or I would react to it. And that's the underlying theme. So organizations, 8 out of 10 organizations that we work or interface with are under some form of evolution from AV to EDR. That's a $4 investment per endpoint just to upgrade. Right? And organizations are doing this across thousands of endpoints because they're thinking about, how do I improve my detection? How do I improve my response? That's the angle that organizations are taking today. Right? And so if you think about the costs of ransomware, there are direct and indirect costs. And I'm not going to talk too much about the direct costs of ransomware because a lot of data is out there. But the indirect costs are really about, as I talked to you about, organizations, CISOs that have bad budgets at the start of the year are thinking about different ways to get ahead of this problem, right? And this is actually a business problem. It's not even a CISO problem, right? CEOs are getting involved. So if you look at the delta, if you look at the amount of technology investment at the start of a year to stop a threat from happening or an attack from happening, that's a huge cost. Number two is the cost of backing up your data. You do it on the endpoint, you do it on the network, you do it in the data center, you do it on cloud. You continuously back up your data. That requires technology, it requires time. And third is the FTE resource that are required for organizations to deploy and manage these solutions and processes. So you can see here that there's a huge amount of investment that goes in the start of a month or start of a year, just managing the ransomware threat. So we like to call this expense in depth. This is an idea that was brought up by Forrester, right? So I want to talk about the containment challenge. And to do that, I'm going to use a very simple example with Bob. Now, Bob, we all have Bobs. Bob works at home. There's a remote worker, and that's happening a lot in 2020. Now, Bob authorizes onto the network through NAC, clicks on a specific or a suspicious link at home with untethered internet access, and downloads something. Now, your first point of control or your first point of defense is really that endpoint or that EDR solution. And while that solution is trying to figure out whether this strain or this hash or this file is malicious, Bob's laptop now has the ability to talk to other laptops through lateral movement, through ports and processes that may be alarmed. And depending on how this malware operates, it could take advantage of those ports and processes. So what we start to see is that Bob's laptop now is starting to compromise or starting to infect other laptops inside the network. Now, 2 hours pass, and that solution is now capable or has thought that this is a bad file or this is a malicious file, and therefore Bob's posture is changed to non-compliant and it's kicked off the network. But you can see the amount of damage that's been done within those 2 hours. Bob's laptop has now been the cause for 3 other laptops to get compromised. So if you think about the containment challenge, now organizations today primarily invest in technology at initial access, stopping a threat from coming in through RDP or vulnerable systems or weak application settings, right? So there's a lot of knowledge base going in here, a lot of hours going in here to manage this, and a lot of money actually. If you look at credential theft, this is exactly where organizations use credentials to elevate the access and their ability to move across the network. And this is exactly what a threat vector would do as well. And then you've got lateral movement. The way that I see it, right, is lateral movement is that fundamental moment in the phase or in the cycle of a kill chain or a cycle of a malware that takes it from one endpoint to 6,000 endpoints or 6,000 servers. And lateral movement is that critical stage, because if I can move from Bob's laptop to all the other laptops, I now have a chance of getting to the crown jewels, to the core services, right, to the admin devices on the network. And then you've got persistence and payload. But the big challenge is, how do I stop lateral movement inside the environment? Now, lateral movement in the endpoint becomes a GPO problem. Lateral movement inside the data center becomes an infrastructure problem. And so this is where organizations tend to struggle. And this is a big area, because if you can control lateral movement, you can make those large breaches a small breach with one laptop rather than 6,000 laptops and 6,000 servers. Now, let me take you through how TrickBot as a vector was used to drop the Ryuk ransomware. Right? Initial phase was all about a phishing campaign. And this tends to be, and has proved to be, still a large problem for organizations, because there's a huge human element here, right, in terms of managing email security. Now, once that gets into a specific endpoint or a device, you start to see the propagation of that threat through SMB ports across the endpoints. So it starts to move. And this is what I was talking about, the containment challenge, right? So it continues to move across to other devices. And that's when you start to see the payload being downloaded from a CNC onto multiple endpoints, and you start seeing administrative tools like PowerShell and PSExec being exploited for propagation. This is where you also start seeing a lot of clever ideas behind ransomware, where you see persistence kicking in, deletion of backups, and making sure all of that investment to protect your data is now useless. And then you start seeing, obviously, the final stages, which is encryption and then collection of that ransomware. But if you think about it, what took this threat from one endpoint to multiple endpoints? It's that phase two. It's propagation, it's lateral movement. So this is how containment would potentially stop that threat from moving across the network. Because if that SMB port was denied, if that malware could not take advantage of an open port or a process, then you would stop seeing that propagation, and it would end at phase two. So you would now have a problem with one endpoint rather than all your endpoints. And that's a lot easier to fix than multiple endpoints, right? As we've seen. So why has containment kind of been the challenge here, right? So if you look at containment as a challenge, like I said, a lot of organizations are spending a lot of time and resource on detection. EPP and EDR are reactive tools. That's the reality. They look at updated signatures and rules. They use some form of ML, but they always kind of boil down to identifying something that they can say is bad or good. The second thing is, if you look at operational difficulty to scale a containment program, it's huge. If you look at GPO programming, as soon as you start to do that past 50 endpoints, it becomes extremely difficult. Now that's just to set it up, but to maintain it is even harder. Number three is NAC tools. Like NAC tools are by default are kind of attached to the network and the infrastructure, and anything that's attached to the network and infrastructure, including firewalls, are hard to deploy, and they're expensive to maintain, not just from the cost of the maintenance, but also the number of people that you need to hire to maintain this solution. So that's where Zero Trust kicks in. Now, if you look at Zero Trust, it takes the existing framework. Now, what we are used to thinking about is all about detection and response. It's about stopping things from coming onto the network. Now, but Zero Trust follows a different approach. It takes a model called assume breach. Now, assume breach is basically the idea that rather than thinking all your firewalls and your solutions at the perimeter can stop bad things from coming in, assume that everything in your network is already compromised. You already have ransomware and malware and Trojans and insider threats. They're all over the network. Now, when you take that assumption, you have no choice but to think about, how do I prevent that from moving? If I had one endpoint that's already, I've assumed is breached, how would I stop that from moving to my most critical server? Right? And when you start to think about it in that angle, now that's where it kicks in. You start to think about, how do I prevent lateral movement and how do I take containment as part of my strategy? Now, it's not a rip and replace. Now, detection and response is there to keep 95% of the threats out there, right? You want to keep them out of your network. But you need to have a strategy for the growing number of zero-day attacks and the growing number of missed kind of malware that come into the network, and you want to make sure that that threat can't move freely. Now, the challenge of containment is not just restricted to the endpoint, because at the end of the day, you have a huge number of devices on the network that are not just endpoints. They're servers, they're IoT devices, they're unmanaged devices that don't have an OS. You've got public cloud environments. So the complexity of the relationships between these devices actually make it even harder. Now, endpoints are a challenge, but enterprise servers are even harder because they're even more ingrained to the data center or the network or the infrastructure. The way that these things are segmented today are heavily coupled with network and infrastructure. So when you think about doing more containment or preventing communication, it gets even harder to do because there's so much more reliance down to the network and infrastructure. So in my example, when I talked about Bob, I'm now looking at that Bob's impact moving on to the whole data center. So rather than just 3 laptops getting compromised, you have a potential threat within the data center through all your other connected devices. If you're an OT environment, if there's connectivity there, you're looking at threats as well. Now, in this diagram, you still see tools like zones and subnets. You can see some form of segmentation that's built, but the reality is that there are existential flows. There are flows that have been approved and allowed and haven't been removed. There are firewall rules there that may not be current, that have not been taken out, that allow connectivity. And don't forget, there are applications that need to connect to each other to actually get the application running, right? And that's the reality. But when you have zero visibility and zero control, segmentation becomes extremely difficult. So when you think about a zero trust strategy, you've got to think about it holistically. But that doesn't mean you need to start big bang, right? And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes here just talking about Illumio Edge. Now, this is Illumio's endpoint solution, and it works in a very simple fashion. It's an agent-based approach. Now, this agent sits on top of the guest OS. It sits in harmony with your other solutions. It's compatible. And its job is first and primary is to provide telemetry information to Illumio's cloud-based management console to tell us what kind of connectivity do we see in the endpoint estate for an organization. Because once you see that, you can see that there's RDP, WMI, there's Skype, there's Zoom allowed. You can then start to decide, what do I want to allow and what do I not want to allow? When you write that strategy, Illumio is a zero trust aligned whitelisting policy. So you would only allow statements or write allow statements, and everything else default would deny, right? Would deny default. So Illumio provides the visibility for an organization to understand the existing flows, because that is difficult as well. Wherever the endpoint is, it could be at a cafe, it could be at home, it could be in an airport, or it could be in the office, doesn't matter. Illumio's Edge solution gives you the visibility, and it then allows you to write very simple based policies that would allow you to control what kind of flows are allowed. Now, the end game here is all about containment. It isn't about protecting every single laptop from malware. It is ensuring that one laptop getting compromised doesn't mean 99% or 100% of your laptops get compromised, right? The solution is extremely light, and it works in conjunction, like I said, to your other investments. Now, I'd like to kind of finish up on a couple of takeaways. The first takeaway is that 2020 has proven that ransomware will continue to grow and organizations will continue to struggle with managing this problem. We've seen about 667% increase in phishing attempts this year. We've seen about 150% increase in the number of ransomware attacks. And the most damning kind of stat that I would say from this slide is the number of zero-day attacks. You've seen about 67% of all the attacks are 0 days. Now, organizations today always prepare for the 99%, which is not a 0 day. A 0 day has always been thought of as the outlier. If you get a 0 day, it's unlucky and it might be hard for you to manage that. But the reality that 67% of the attacks are 0 days means that that is shifting drastically. There are going to be more 0 days. So your approaches to detect and respond that may not be able to identify a 0 day. You have to start thinking about phase 2 of that plan. What do I do with the missed attacks? So take 2 is continue to do what you do in terms of patching systems that may be exploited, patching systems that are more vulnerable, or patching systems that are more exposed. For the systems that you can't patch fast enough or effectively enough, start thinking about compensating controls. Think about microsegmentation. Think about preventing lateral movement by using those host-based firewalls. Use a scalable containment strategy to ensure that whatever you can't catch doesn't bring down the whole environment. Just brings down one server or brings down one laptop, but not the whole environment. And number 3 is look at zero trust as a real strategy moving forward. Right? It's a complementary strategy to your existing investments. It leverages the tools that you have already invested in. It is not a solution. It's not a product. It's a framework. And start thinking about zero trust in a scalable way. Zero trust can start with your most critical applications. They can start with your most exposed applications. It can start with your core services. Right? It can start with your most important devices that have access to your most important data. And that way, you're not looking at do it all in 6 months, but it is a 5-year journey. And you can grow as you kind of see fit. So zero trust is not a product. It's not a one-time thing. It's a journey. And you can start with a framework or organizations out there that are helping companies get there, right? So just a final say, if you are interested in understanding a little bit more about Illumio Edge and the work that we do on the endpoint, you can go to our website and try Illumio Edge for free. One of us would reach out to you to start a conversation. I think the important thing is for us to explain to you the methodology as much as the technology in getting you there. And I'm going to stick around for about 10 minutes from now. So if you have any questions with regards to containment or with regards to Illumio or our field experience out there deploying this for a ton of customers, feel free to ask those questions and I'd love to answer them. But otherwise, thank you very much. My name is Vishal and I'm looking forward to connecting with you in the future.